A comedian walks on stage and tells a joke. It's edgy. It's provocative. It pushes boundaries the way comedy always has pushed boundaries. Some people in the audience laugh. Others are offended. This used to be normal. Comedy was supposed to challenge you, to make you uncomfortable, to say things that needed to be said, but that couldn't be said in polite conversation. But now, that comedian faces a mob. Social media explodes with demands that he be canceled. His shows are protested. Venues refuse to book him. Streaming services remove his specials. His career is destroyed, not because he committed a crime, not because he actually harmed anyone, but because he told jokes that offended people. This is happening across all forms of art. Musicians pressured to apologize for lyrics. Authors having books pulled from publication. Filmmakers attacked for the content of their films. Painters facing backlash for their subjects. Actors fired for taking controversial roles. The entire artistic world is being suffocated by people who think that art should only express approved opinions and that anything offensive should be suppressed. The excuse is always the same: that offensive art causes harm, that it perpetuates discrimination, that it creates unsafe spaces, that marginalized people have the right not to be confronted with art that makes them uncomfortable, that artists have a responsibility to use their platforms to advance social justice rather than to create freely. But this is the death of art. Real art challenges. Real art provokes. Real art explores difficult subjects and uncomfortable truths. Real art says things that need to be said, even when saying them is unpopular. When you require art to be safe and inoffensive and politically correct, you don't get art. You get propaganda and committee-approved pablum. The stakes here go beyond art itself. Art shapes culture. Art influences how people think and what they value. Art has always been one of the primary ways that societies work through moral and political questions. When you suppress artistic freedom, when you require that art conform to ideological standards, you're not just limiting artists. You're limiting society's ability to grapple with difficult questions and to explore different perspectives. Today, we're going to examine why artistic freedom matters, what's threatening it, and why defending free expression in the arts is essential, not just for artists, but for everyone. Because a society that can't tolerate offensive art is a society that can't tolerate dissent. And a society that cannot tolerate dissent is not free.
Courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to Awaken America.
Before we talk about threats to artistic freedom, we need to understand what art is and what function it serves. Because art isn't just entertainment. Art is not just decoration. Art is one of the most fundamental ways that human beings make sense of the world and communicate with each other. Art explores the human condition. It asks questions about meaning, morality, beauty, truth, suffering, joy. It tries to capture and communicate experiences and insights that can't be expressed in straightforward propositional language. It shows us things about ourselves and our world that we might not otherwise see. Art is often uncomfortable. It challenges our assumptions. It makes us confront things we'd rather avoid. It prevents perspectives we disagree with. It forces us to think about difficult subjects. This discomfort is not a flaw. This is art doing what it's supposed to do. Consider great literature. The classics that have endured for centuries often deal with deeply troubling subjects: murder, betrayal, sexual desire, violence, moral corruption. They present characters who do terrible things. They explore the darkest aspects of human nature. And we value these works not despite this, but because of it. Shakespeare is full of violence and moral complexity. His characters murder, betray, lust, scheme. His plays explore every vice and weakness that humans are capable of. This doesn't make Shakespeare harmful. It makes him great. Because he's showing us truths about human nature that we need to confront. Dostoevsky takes you inside the minds of murderers and nihilists. He makes you understand how someone could come to commit terrible acts. He doesn't endorse those acts, but he explores them honestly. This psychological and moral complexity is what makes his work valuable. Greek tragedy is founded on presenting horrible events and exploring their implications. Oedipus kills his father and marries his mother. Medea murders her children. These stories have endured for millennia, not because they're pleasant, but because they grapple with fundamental human experiences of fate, guilt, revenge, and suffering. Comedy has always pushed boundaries. Court jesters could say things to kings that no one else could say because comedy creates space to challenge authority and mock sacred cows. Satire has always been one of the most effective tools for social criticism, precisely because it's indirect. Because it uses humor to make points that would be rejected if stated directly. Visual art has always challenged conventional sensibilities. Artists have always painted subjects that made people uncomfortable, that violated social norms, that explored sexuality and violence and other taboo subjects. This is part of how art functions. It goes places that polite society can't go. Music pushes boundaries too. Rock and roll was condemned as corrupting youth. Hip-hop was attacked as promoting violence and degrading women. Every generation has moral panics about music that challenges conventional values. And yet, that challenging music often becomes culturally important precisely because it articulated something that needed to be said. The point of all of this is that art is supposed to challenge. It's supposed to make you think. It's supposed to present perspectives and experiences outside your own. It's supposed to explore subjects that are difficult or controversial or uncomfortable. This is not art failing. This is art succeeding. When we try to make art safe, when we require that art not offend anyone, When we demand that art conform to approved ideological positions, we destroy what makes art valuable. We turn art into propaganda or entertainment that reinforces rather than challenging existing beliefs. Art is also subjective. What one person finds meaningful and beautiful, another finds offensive or worthless. What speaks to one person's experiences leaves another cold. This diversity of response is normal and healthy. It's part of what makes art interesting. But the current climate treats offense as objective harm. If anyone is offended by art, that art is treated as problematic regardless of its artistic merit or what it's trying to communicate. This gives veto power over artistic expression to the most easily offended, which means the most restrictive and censorious voices control what art can exist. This is backwards. In a free society, the response to art you find offensive is not to demand it be suppressed. The response is to create your own art, to criticize the offensive artist, to choose not to engage with it. But you don't get to prevent others from creating or experiencing it. The attempt to sanitize art, to make it safe and inoffensive, is an attempt to infantilize audiences. It assumes people can't handle being exposed to ideas they disagree with or images they find disturbing. It treats adults like children who need to be protected from anything that might upset them. But adults can handle offensive art. They can engage with it critically. They can decide for themselves whether it has value or whether it's trash. They can choose to avoid art they don't want to experience. What they can't do in a free society is prevent others from creating or experiencing art. So, what's actually threatening artistic freedom right now? What are the mechanisms by which art is being suppressed and artists are being punished for creating work that challenges conventional sensibilities or progressive orthodoxy? Start with cancel culture targeting artists. When an artist creates something that offends progressive sensibilities, social media mobs organize to destroy that artist's career. They pressure venues to cancel shows. They pressure publishers to drop books. They pressure streaming services to remove content. They pressure employers to fire artists. This isn't criticism. Criticism is healthy and normal. Creating art that responds to or critiques other art is part of the artistic process. What we're seeing is not criticism, but organized campaigns to ensure that offensive art cannot be seen and that artists who create it can't work. Comedians face this constantly. Dave Chappelle tells jokes about transgender issues and faces massive backlash. Netflix employees stage walkouts demanding his special be removed. Protesters show up at his shows. Venues face pressure to cancel him. This isn't about criticism. This is about trying to silence him. The same pattern plays out with other comedians who refuse to conform to progressive orthodoxy. Ricky Gervais, Bill Burr, Joe Rogan. they get attacked for not just their comedy, but for having controversial guests on their podcasts. The message is clear. Conform or face destruction. Musicians face it too. Artists are pressured to disavow old lyrics, to apologize for songs they wrote years ago, to remove content that's now considered offensive. Morgan Wallen faced backlash for using a racial slur in private and was dropped by radio stations and streaming playlists. Not for anything in his music, for a private conversation that was recorded without his knowledge. Authors are attacked for the content of their books. Young adult authors, in particular, face intense scrutiny from social media activists who police content for anything that might be problematic. Authors are accused of cultural appropriation for writing characters from different backgrounds. They're accused of promoting harmful stereotypes. They're accused of not including enough diverse representation or of including diverse representation incorrectly. Some authors have had book deals canceled before publication because of social media backlash. Others have books pulled from shelves after publication. Some have been dropped by agents or publishers. The message to authors is clear. Only write approved narratives with approved characters expressing approved values. Publishers are increasingly risk-averse. They're afraid of controversy. They're afraid of social media backlash. So they're less likely or less willing to publish challenging work or work that might offend anyone. This creates self-censorship where writers don't even try to publish work that pushes boundaries because they know it won't be accepted. Visual artists face attacks too. Paintings are removed from exhibitions because they depict subjects that are now considered offensive. Sculptures are destroyed or removed. Artists are accused of cultural appropriation for drawing on influences from other cultures. The standards keep shifting so that more and more art becomes problematic. Museums and galleries have become incredibly cautious about what they display. They provide extensive content warnings. They remove work in response to complaints. They prioritize diversity and inclusion over artistic merit in ways that amount to censorship of work that doesn't advance approved narratives. Film and television face enormous pressure from activist groups. Scripts are reviewed for potential offense. Casting decisions are scrutinized. Content is changed in response to sensitivity readers and diversity consultants. The creative process is being strangled by committee oversight designed to prevent anything offensive from being produced. Artists face backlash for taking roles that activists think should go to someone else. Scarlett Johansson faced attacks for being cast as a transgender character and had to drop out of the role. Voice actors have been pressured to stop voicing characters of different races. The principle seems to be that actors should only portray characters who match their own identity categories. Streaming services and platforms exercise enormous control over what art reaches audiences. They can remove content that generates controversy. They can promote content that aligns with their values and bury content that doesn't. They use content moderation policies that effectively censor based on ideological criteria. Educational institutions are teaching the next generation of artists that their primary obligation is not to artistic excellence or creative expression, but to social justice. Art programs emphasize identity, oppression, representation. Students are taught to view art through ideological lenses rather than aesthetic ones. This creates a generation of artists who self-censor, who are more concerned with avoiding offense than with creating powerful work, who see art primarily as a vehicle for activism rather than as an end in itself. This is the death of artistic risk-taking and innovation. The result of all these pressures is narrowing of acceptable artistic expression. Work that challenges progressive orthodoxy faces suppression. Work that explores controversial subjects in ways that might offend gets attacked. Work that presents perspectives outside the approved narrative becomes impossible to create or distribute. This creates a monoculture where all art expresses the same basic values and perspectives, where diversity means demographic diversity, but complete ideological conformity, where art becomes propaganda for approved positions rather than genuine exploration of human experience. The suppression of artistic freedom matters beyond its impact on artists and art itself. Art shapes culture. Art influences how people think about moral and political questions. Art is one of the primary ways societies explore different values and perspectives. When you control art, you control cultural conversation. Consider how art has historically functioned in social change. Uncle Tom's Cabin influenced public opinion about slavery. The Jungle exposed conditions in meatpacking plants and led to regulatory reform. To Kill a Mockingbird shaped how Americans thought about racial justice. These works were controversial when they appeared. They challenged prevailing attitudes. They made people uncomfortable. If we had the current climate of censorship and cancel culture when these works appeared, would they have been allowed? Uncle Tom's Cabin would be attacked for its portrayal of black characters. The Jungle would be considered too graphic and disturbing. To Kill a Mockingbird is already being removed from schools for its use of racial slurs in historically accurate context. Art that challenges power, that exposes injustice, that advocates for change, has always faced resistance from those with vested interest in the status quo. But now, the censorship is coming from the left, from people who claim to be progressive, but who are enforcing ideological conformity as rigidly as any conservative moral majority ever did. The difference is that When conservatives tried to censor art in the past, the artistic establishment largely resisted. Artists and institutions defended artistic freedom, even for art that conservatives found offensive. But now, much of the artistic establishment has joined the mob. Publishers, museums, streaming services, they're enforcing the censorship rather than resisting it. This is partly because the economics have changed. Art is increasingly controlled by large corporations that are risk-averse and responsive to social media pressure. A museum might want to defend artistic freedom, but if a controversial exhibit threatens donations or brings negative publicity, the board pressures them to cave. Streaming services like Netflix or Spotify face organized campaigns to remove content. They can either stand firm and face ongoing controversy, or they can remove the content and move on. The economic incentive is to cave, to remove offensive content, to avoid controversy. Principle doesn't show up on the balance sheet. This corporate control over art distribution is particularly dangerous. When a few large platforms control access to audiences, those platforms can effectively censor by removing or deplatforming. An artist who gets banned from YouTube or Spotify or Amazon loses access to most of their potential audience. The suppression of artistic freedom also affects political discourse. Satire and comedy have always been important tools for political criticism. When you can't mock authority, when you can't use humor to expose hypocrisy or challenge power, political discourse becomes more rigid and serious. The safety valve that comedy provides is removed. Look at how late-night comedy has become. It used to be that comedians would mock all politicians roughly equally. Now most late-night shows are essentially propaganda for progressive politics. They'll savage conservatives, but treat progressives with kid gloves. This is not because conservative politicians don't deserve mockery. It's because the economic and social incentives all push in one direction. Comedies who do mock progressive sacred cows face backlash, so most comedians in mainstream venues don't do it. The range of acceptable comedy narrows. The Overton window shifts. What you're allowed to joke about becomes more and more restricted. This affects what political ideas can be expressed and how. If comedy can only punch in one direction, if satire can only target approved enemies, then half the political spectrum is protected from the kind of humorous criticism that's most effective at exposing flaws and weaknesses. The moral dimension is important too. Art has always been one of the ways society works through moral questions. Literature explores moral dilemmas. Film presents moral choices and their consequences. Even controversial art that seems to promote immorality often functions to make people think about why that behavior is wrong. When you can only present approved moral positions, When you can explore moral complexity or present morally flawed characters or ask difficult questions about right and wrong, you lose this moral exploration function. Art becomes moralistic rather than moral, preaching rather than questioning. Consider how much great literature involves morally complex characters, characters who do wrong things, but who we understand and perhaps we sympathize with. Characters who face genuine moral dilemmas where the right answer isn't obvious. Characters who evolve morally over the course of the story. This moral complexity is being squeezed out. Characters must be unambiguously good or bad. Moral lessons must be clear and aligned with approved values. Complexity is suspect because it might lead to wrong conclusions. This produces boring, didactic art that doesn't engage with moral reality. The political right needs to learn from past mistakes here. Conservatives have historically been prone to moral panic about art. Rock music, violent video games, explicit films, conservatives have often called for censorship of art they found immoral or corrupting. This was wrong then, and it's definitely wrong now. The answer to art you find offensive is not censorship. The answer is more art. Create art that expresses your values. Support artists who share your worldview. But don't try to suppress art that offends you, because once you establish the principle that offensive art should be banned, that weapon will be turned against you. Let's dig into why art specifically matters for moral and cultural discourse. Why can't we just have direct political and philosophical arguments? Why do we need art to explore these questions? Art reaches people in ways that argument doesn't. A philosophical treatise on justice might be rigorous and correct, but it won't move most people. A story about injustice, a character experiencing and fighting against oppression, this reaches people emotionally and makes abstract concepts concrete and personal. Uncle Tom's Cabin changed minds about slavery not because it had better arguments than the abolitionists who wrote philosophical and political tracts. It changed minds because it made slavery real and human in ways that argument couldn't. People who might have been unmoved by moral arguments were moved by the story of Eliza crossing the ice or Tom suffering. Art can present perspectives that readers might not otherwise consider. When you read a novel from the perspective of a character very different from yourself, you're inhabiting their consciousness, seeing the world through their eyes. This builds empathy and understanding in ways that simply being told about different perspectives can't do. This is why representation in art matters, though not in the way activists claim. It's not that every identity group needs to see themselves in art or they'll feel invalidated. It's that seeing the world from different perspectives, experiencing life through characters unlike yourself, this expands your moral and emotional range. But it only works if the art is genuine. If it's created by artists trying to capture truth rather than trying to promote ideology. When art becomes propaganda, when characters exist to represent identity categories and advance political positions rather than to be fully realized human beings, it loses this power. Art it also allows exploration of ideas that might be too controversial or complex for a direct argument. You can present a morally ambiguous character doing morally ambiguous things and let the audience grapple with how they feel about it. You can explore dark aspects of human nature without endorsing them. You can ask questions without providing answers. This ambiguity is threatening to activists who want to promote clear moral and political messages. They want villains who are obviously villains and heroes who represent the approved values. They want stories that teach the right lessons, but this eliminates the exploratory and questioning functioning that makes art valuable. Consider a novel like American Psycho. It presents a character who does horrific things. It's disturbing and offensive, but it's exploring something about American consumer culture, about masculinity, about violence underlying civilized surfaces. You can debate whether it does this successfully, but you can't deny it's trying to do something more than just depict violence. Or, how about Lolita, which is told from the perspective of a pedophile? It's deeply uncomfortable, but it's not endorsing pedophilia. It's exploring how predators think, how they justify themselves, how they manipulate. It's a psychological study that only works because it refuses to editorialize or make the moral lessons obvious. These works would likely be impossible to publish today. They would be condemned for depicting abuse without clearly condemning it, for humanizing villains, for making readers uncomfortable in ways that activists would claim causes harm. But we'd lose something important if these works couldn't exist. Art also preserves cultural memory in ways that history and journalism don't. The experience of the Great Depression is preserved not just in economic data, but in Steinbeck's novels. The Vietnam War is captured not just in news footage, but in films and music and literature produced during and after the war. September 11th will be understood by future generations partly through the art created in response to it. This cultural memory function requires that art be able to capture experiences honestly, including disturbing and controversial aspects. If art can only present approved narratives, if it has to sanitize history to avoid offense, it fails to preserve accurate cultural memory. The current push to remove or modify older art that doesn't meet contemporary standards threatens this memory function. When we remove historically accurate language from classic novels, when we edit old films to remove content now considered offensive, we're sanitizing the past in ways that make it harder to understand. Art also allows us to ask, what if? Questions about morality and society, Science fiction and dystopian fiction explore what might happen if certain trends continue, or if society is organized differently. The speculation helps us think about the consequences of choices in ways that abstract arguments cannot. Orwell's 1984 has influenced how we think about totalitarianism and surveillance more than any political science text. Brave New World shapes how we think about the dangers of technological control and the pursuit of pleasure. These works present nightmare scenarios that help us recognize and resist similar patterns in reality. But this only works if artists are free to imagine dark futures and dystopian scenarios without being accused of promoting what they're warning against. If every depiction of injustice is treated as endorsement of injustice, artists can't use fiction to explore moral and political dangers. Art also provides a space for moral and political disagreement that's less direct and therefore less threatening than explicit argument. You can present a character who holds views you disagree with and make that character compelling and human. This forces the audience to grapple with why they disagree rather than just dismissing the view. It requires that artists be allowed to create sympathetic characters who hold problematic views. It requires that art not be judged purely on whether every character's words and actions aligned with approved ideology. It requires trust that audiences can engage with complex art without being corrupted by it. So how do we protect artistic freedom? How do we resist the current push toward censorship and ideological conformity in art? This requires action from multiple directions. Artists need to be braver. Too many artists are self-censoring, are avoiding controversial subjects, are conforming to ideological expectations out of fear of backlash. This is understandable given the climate, but it's also how artistic freedom dies. Artists need to create the work they believe in and accept the potential consequences. This is easier said than done. Artists need to make a living. They're dependent on publishers, labels, venues, platforms. Standing up for artistic freedom can end your career. But if enough artists refuse to self-censor, if enough artists create challenging work despite the risks, the culture can change. Some artists are doing this. Dave Chappelle keeps creating controversial specials despite the backlash. Ricky Gervais refuses to apologize or back down. These artists have enough success and wealth that they can afford to take risks. But emerging artists need support to do the same. Audiences need to support controversial art. If an artist faces cancel campaigns, buy their work, show up to their events, make it economically viable for artists to resist mob pressure. The mobs only win if they can make controversial art financially unsustainable. This means sometimes supporting art that you don't even like. You might find certain comedy offensive or certain novels poorly written. But if artists are being suppressed for ideological reasons rather than a lack of merit, support them anyway. The principle of artistic freedom is more important than whether you personally enjoy every work. Institutions need to defend artistic freedom. Museums, publishers, galleries, venues, streaming services, these institutions need to resist pressure to censor. When activists demand that controversial work be removed or canceled, institutions need to stand firm and defend the artist's right to create and the audience's right to experience that art. This requires institutional courage that's currently lacking. Institutions are risk-averse. They cave to pressure to avoid controversy. This needs to change. Institutions that want to be taken seriously as defenders of art and culture need to actually defend art and artists when they're attacked. Some institutions are better than others on this. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression defends free speech rights, including for artists. PEN America, despite its flaws, has defended some controversial writers. These organizations need more support and more institutional backing. Legal protections from artistic freedom need to be strengthened. The First Amendment provides strong protection in the U.S., but those protections need to be actively defended. When governments or institutions try to suppress art, lawsuits should follow. Artists whose rights are violated need legal representation. Corporate control over artistic distribution needs to be challenged. When a few platforms control access to audiences, those platforms have too much power to censor. We need more diverse distribution channels. We need platforms that are committed to hosting controversial content. We need artists to be less dependent on their corporate gatekeepers. This is partly about technology, independent platforms, direct-to-audience distribution. These create alternatives to corporate control. Artists who can reach audiences directly without going through traditional gatekeepers have more freedom to create controversial works. Critics need to remember the difference between criticism and censorship. Criticizing art you disagree with is healthy. Explaining why you think art is harmful or wrong-headed is legitimate discourse. But organizing campaigns to prevent that art from being seen, to punish the artist, to suppress the work, this crosses the line into censorship. Engage with art on its merits. Make arguments about why it's good or bad, valuable or worthless, insightful or misleading. But don't try to prevent others from experiencing it and judging it for themselves. Trust audiences to be able to handle controversial content. Education needs to teach appreciation for artistic freedom. Students should learn about the history of censorship and why free expression matters. They should learn to engage with art they find offensive without demanding it be suppressed. They should learn that being offended is not harm, and that encountering challenging art is part of being an educated person. This runs counter to current trends in education that teach students to expect trigger warnings and safe spaces and protection from offensive content. We need to reserve this and teach resilience, critical engagement, and appreciation for the value of artistic freedom, even for art that you hate. Political action matters too. Elect officials who support free speech. Oppose laws and regulations that censor art. Push back against government funding being conditional or ideological conformity. Support policies that protect artistic freedom from both government censorship and corporate suppression. Finally, we need to rebuild the cultural consensus that artistic freedom is valuable, even when art offends us. For much of American history, there was broad agreement that free expression was important and that the answer to offensive speech was more speech, not censorship. That consensus has collapsed among progressives who now support censorship when it targets speech they dislike. Rebuilding this consensus requires both arguing for the value of free expression and modeling tolerance for art we find offensive. It requires defending the artistic freedom of people whose work we hate because the principle matters more than any individual work. The current threats to artistic freedom are serious and growing. Cancel culture is targeting artists. Institutions are caving to pressure to suppress controversial work. The range of acceptable artistic expression is narrowing. Art is being reduced to propaganda and committee-approved entertainment. This matters because art shapes culture and moral understanding. Art is how societies explore difficult questions and work through moral and political challenges. Art presents perspectives and experiences outside of our own. Art challenges conventional thinking and makes us uncomfortable in ways that help us grow. When you suppress artistic freedom, when you require that art conform to ideological standards, when you punish artists for creating challenging work, you're not just limiting art, you're limiting society's ability to grapple with hard questions. You're eliminating one of the primary ways that culture evolves and adapts. The current censorship is coming primarily from the left, from progressives who claim to value diversity and inclusion, but who enforce rigid ideological conformity. This is a betrayal of the liberal principles that the left used to defend. When conservatives tried to censor art in the past, progressives rightfully resisted. Now, progressives are the censors, and conservatives need to be the defenders of artistic freedom. This requires being consistent. It requires defending artistic freedom even for art that offends conservative sensibilities. It requires rejecting the impulse to ban or suppress art that promotes values you disagree with. It requires understanding that the principle of free expression is more important than any particular work. Artists need courage to create challenging work despite the risks. Audiences need to support controversial artists. Institutions need to defend artistic freedom against mob pressure. Critics need to distinguish between criticism and censorship. Educators need to teach appreciation for free expression. Politicians need to protect artistic freedom through law and policy. Art should challenge us. It should make us think. It should present perspectives we disagree with. It should explore subjects that make us uncomfortable. This is not art failing. This is art succeeding. Safe, inoffensive art that merely reinforces what we already believe is not art. It's propaganda or entertainment that demands nothing from us. Free societies need art that challenges authorities and controversial thinking. They need satire that mocks the powerful. They need stories that explore moral complexity. They need comedy that pushes boundaries. They need visual art that disturbs. They need music that rebels. When we lose the ability to create and experience challenging art, we lose something essential to human flourishing. We lose the ability to explore difficult questions. We lose the capacity to see the world from different perspectives. We lose the cultural memory that art preserves. We lose the moral complexity that art allows us to grapple with. The fight for artistic freedom is not separate from other fights for freedom. It's all connected. When you establish that offensive expression should be suppressed, that principle extends beyond art to all speech. When you give mobs power to destroy artists' careers for controversial work, you create a climate of fear that affects everyone. Defending artistic freedom requires standing up for artists you might not like, for work you might find offensive, for perspectives you strongly disagree with. That's hard. But that's what principle requires. Either free expression matters enough to defend even when it's costly, or it doesn't matter at all. The artists creating challenging work despite the risks deserve our support. The institutions standing firm against pressure to censor deserve our backing. The critics defending artistic freedom, even for art that they hate, deserve our respect. These people are holding the line for a principle that benefits all of us. Choose to be part of that defense. Support controversial artists. Attend controversial exhibits. Read banned books. Watch canceled comedy. Make it economically sustainable for artists to take risks. And speak up when mobs come for artists. Use your voice to defend artistic freedom, even when you disagree with the art being defended. That's how we protect free expression in the arts. That's how we preserve the cultural space for genuine exploration and challenging work. That's how we maintain the kind of vibrant, diverse artistic culture that makes society worth living in. The alternative is conformity. censorship, and the slow death of art as anything more than propaganda. That's not a future worth accepting. Fight for artistic freedom. It matters more than you think.